Y2K was 20 years ago. What are your best Y2K stories? I lived overseas and was watching the news with family and friends on the Armed Forces Network. The newscast did the countdown and then at 1 they cut the feed and it went to static. There were several gasps and then about 5 seconds later the feed came back and the newscast shouted, "Just kidding. Happy New Year." I thought it was pretty clever. I was at a big house party and the owner's GF at the time threw the main breaker to the house at midnight. Since this was out of town and back in the woods a bit, this resulted in almost total darkness and quiet except for the stars and critters and everyone freaking out a little bit. She flipped it back on after about 5-10 am. We all thought it was pretty funny. With the exception of the one guy that was on a little bit more of some substances than others there and lost his marbles for a while. He ended up running off in the woods for a few hours but eventually made it back to the house asking if the world was alright. Good times. I worked in it at one of the Dow Industrial Company's headquarters. And I spent a high percentage of 1999 doing Y2K tests on every single computer, server, printer, fax machine and, I'm pretty sure, coffee maker. No problems. And no signs of problems. That year was a waste of my life. My favorite thing was cemetery headstones that were not Y2K compliant. People had headstones made before they died with the 19 pre-engraved, planning on filling in the next 2 digits when the time came. Oops. They kept living. I was managing the department in a state agency, and were under enormous pressure to prevent any Y2K problems. On NY Day I went to work before dawn and tested everything before the exec director arrived. Relieved that everything was working okay, we went to IHOP for a celebratory breakfast. The IHOP bill was date timed stamped 32 December 1999. In October, my dad finished off the spam he purchased for Y2K. He bought 12 cases of it because it was super cheap leading up to Y2K and he just really enjoys spam. I am honestly impressed at the dedication of someone to eat 288 cans of spam over 20 years. Lived in a house in the middle of the boonies with my friends shortly after high school. This house was owned by a survivalist software engineer who said we could live there rent-free on the condition that we all go through survivalist training by a high-ranking Marine officer at his own expense. This was him initiating a small group of go-getters who would help him recreate society after the apocalypse, which was inevitably coming, most likely with a Y2K societal collapse. I learned how to navigate and triangulate with and without map and compass, lead a group of civilian soldiers, and shoot a Colt 45. By the end of training, I could assemble and disassemble it in a minute and 7 seconds blindfolded. The peak of our training was when my best friend and I, both female, took down a line of cans at 30 yards from the outside in, one starting on the left and the other starting on the right, in complete tandem, hitting the middle one simultaneously. The man who trained us was gushing with pride that day. New Year's came around. We sat by the fire, took some acid and contemplated what was next for our lives. I was 8 during the Y2K craze. Growing up in a small town, about 5,000 people, on the east coast of the USA where most of the people were very religious and scared of technology. At that time only a few households in my neighborhood had a computer but only 1 or 2 had the internet. My parents and I spent night at our next door neighbor's house. They had the internet and were avid hunters who had gone through the hassle of getting extra food and supplies just in case. My neighbors had 2 teenage boys. We were gathered in their basement to watch the ball drop on TV. And right at the stroke of midnight one of the teenage boys snuck over to the circuit breaker and cut the power for the house. The next minute or so was just sheer panic from the adults. I just sat there not fully understanding what was going on. Of course they had flashlights on hand and the teenager who cut the power was quickly found sitting underneath the circuit breaker giggling like a little girl. The giggles quickly turned to fear as his parents started shrieking at him and giving him a whopping. My mother was one of those folks that was convinced that everything was going to implode for Y2K. She thought that it would be like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. No food at the stores. Banks shut down. People rioting, the whole 9 yards. She desperately tried to convince me, my 2 brothers, and all of our families to come to her place in the country and bunker down for the duration. Of course, none of us were going for that, but we did keep in touch so that she didn't worry too much. I will never forget the phone call where she explained that she had stockpiled canned goods, bought a generator, and bought a milk cow. The cow was so that the kids would have milk since there obviously wouldn't be any at the store after all commerce broke down. SHM. Her heart was in the right place, but really mom ? A milk cow? None of the kids were even babies that would need milk. She ended up selling the cow shortly after. Nothing happened. We still laugh about the Y2K milk cow. My dad was a systems analyst, working for what was then a major UK high street retailer based in Liverpool, who had their own in-house EPIS system that my dad worked on. His department learned of the Y2K issue at a conference in 94 or 95, and had the system 90% compliant by 1998, but the management were very cautious. Everything was tested and retested, and dad was on call throughout December 99. With incredibly generous rates. The office was at the Albert Dock, and dad was called on New Year's Eve as a precaution. So we got to watch the fireworks over the Mersey from the top floor where dad's office was. Dad reckons the extra pay, after tax, amounted to about 6 weeks' pay. I am from the rural Midwest. Looking back at my childhood, you would think I grew up in the 1970s and not the 90s because of how country my hometown was. My family didn't really understand Y2K, but they bought into the hype. A lot of religious people were twisting the whole thing into an apocalyptic type of thing. I was a kid and it scared me. I dreaded New Year's Eve, because I was worried that was when the world would end. A few days prior, a low-flying aircraft of some kind flew over the family farm. It was so loud and must have been going fast because there was a sound that may have been a sonic boom. I was outside with my grandpa and I ran inside at the sound, hid under the kitchen table and started bawling. My grandpa fished me out from the table and I told him why I was so scared. He and I rang in the New Year's together that year so he could show me that everything would be fine. We were in high school. Had a huge group of friends, 30 plus, that spent New Year's at my friend's parents' house. We were doing the countdown. Everyone was nervous from all the hype that computers were not going to be able to calculate the date correctly and revert to 1900. Shutting down vital city systems. Internet and computers were just beginning to take over managing everything. For reference, I had a beeper in high school, guys. 5.4.3.2.1. The entire house goes completely dark. Silence. Friend dad comes upstairs, looks at our scared faces and starts scissors off, slapping his legs and doubling over with humor. Can't catch his breath. He flipped the breaker. Lights back, come on. Happy Y2K everyone. It was perfect. I'm a firefighter and was working on the Y2K night. Right at midnight, all of our primary radio and CAD systems failed. It was a huge, system-wide failure, just like everybody predicted would happen. We were getting dispatched by backup radios and our dispatchers were writing down calls on pieces of paper. The suck is that my engine company had the first call of the year, but we didn't get credit for it because of the confusion. When they put calls into the computer after it was fixed, we ended up with call 00013. Duck you engine 3. We were first. Sincerely. E12. My dad had been paid quite a bit over the previous year, as he was a COBOL programmer 20-30 years before. And it was mostly COBOL programs that people worried about. The panic helped increase his wage. A lot of stuff did end up getting fixed, which is why things didn't go as badly as predicted. He didn't work at all this century. Part of it was that he had made enough that he could stop working. But I think a large part was that he developed an inflated sense of what his skills were worth over those few years, and has never been offered anything close since. New Year's Eve itself, I had a very bad cold. I spent most of the night huddled in my bed, At midnight I went across the street for half an hour. Some friends had gotten the key to the roof of the engineering building, the Wahlberg building, and we went up there to watch the fireworks. I think my favorite story I heard about actually happened before 2000. But it was basically the same idea. It was about someone in a northern European country who had turned 105, born in like 1890, receiving a letter in the mail addressed to parents of and his name. The letter was telling his parents that he was supposed to start school now that he was 5 years old. Of course. This happened because the government used a 2-digit date in the computer system and sent a letter to everyone with a 90 birth year. Not really a good story. Or a story. Really. But I used to read the Hip Hop magazine. The Source. And I remember they had an issue on Y2G. As they called it, Yet a Grand. I guess. It was pretty cringy. It had Jay-Z in some weird, metallic, futuristic clothing and some backup dancers with spiky hair on the cover. I've been told that my brothers and I came down with chickenpox. So my parents were stuck at home for Y2K. Better luck next millennium. I guess. I was 10 years old and spent the night at my grandparents' house. My grandparents had stockpiled food just in case but weren't tripping much beyond that. Once it hit midnight. I watched as nothing happened to my digital watch, then we looked outside. Saw our normal fireworks. And on TV everyone at the ball drop was like, okay, cool. So we good. I worked for a county that had several landfill sites with no hydro or water. Including mine. I didn't really believe Y2K was going to happen. But if it did, I was secure knowing that I could move my kids and I to the attendant shack that I worked out of. It was heated with propane and had propane lanterns. Next to it was a large empty storage shed where I figured I could move my rats. I ran a rat rescue at the time and had about 40 of them. No one gets left behind. I had lots of camping supplies on hand, including a portable propane heater for my rats in the storage shed, and I had filled several 5-gallon bottles of water. Just in case. I've always been a bit of a survivalist, so I had, and have, enough food for 4 people to last about 3 months. I figured we had more than enough to stay warm and fed for the few days it would take to get things got back on track. Alternatively, I also have the keys for a small Buddhist cabin in a fairly remote spot. The owner only goes there maybe once a year and only in summer. It also is heated with propane and is waterfront. This is also my getaway in case I'm ever hiding from the law. I went to watch the fireworks in London. Climbed a tree to watch and didn't get arrested. I didn't see any trouble all night. Best behaved crowd ever. Had to walk home cause all the tube stations were closed. I won tickets to a party night hosted by a local radio station that year. So I was in the middle of a major city when midnight happened. Since this was before smartphones, we weren't aware if anything was happening elsewhere. I remember a brief stillness at midnight. Then the party ramping back up when nothing happened. The drive back was eerie. Cops everywhere. I don't know if it was routine or not. I've never been to a party like that since. I was 10 at the time. I cried a little and hugged my family's microwave goodbye. This is wholesome AF. You hugged the microwave. I was the liaison between sales and production for a company that made automatic transfer switches in October 1999. It was my job to make sure production was shipping them out on time. They wouldn't give me a computer, so I had to keep track of everything on paper and fax. I quit in November of 1999. Spent the holidays with my Oma and Opa up north. Woke up the 1st of January 2000 with the house shaking. And for a split second my 9-year-old mind thought everyone who had been freaking out about the new millennium were right. Ended up just being the Kippour earthquake. I drank 2 bottles of red wine. Got a nosebleed. I was working when fiberglass at the time and I used to get them a lot, and was sat on the doorstep vomiting when midnight struck. At the time, my parents loved X-Files and Millennium because they were all the rage at the time. X-Files gave me a legit phobia of aliens to the point of sleepless nights. That went on until freshman year of high school in 2003. Anyway, I was still religious and in Catholic school at the time and was very scared about the end of the world. But specifically because of that Millennium show, even though it ended I think the year prior to 2000. I literally asked my parents to take me to confession because I was so scared. Now, X-Files is my favorite show ever and Millennium is criminally underrated. I was in 8th grade. And I remember my friend's mom was dating someone who fully believed civilization would stop. We went with her to the grocery store to buy $500 worth of canned food. And helped her stack the cans next to his drums of water in the basement. When nothing happened at New Year's I laughed thinking about all the canned corn they would have to eat with dinner for the next year. We're now closer to 2038. Which will be when the real computer date fun will happen. Neighborhood kid hit some kind of transformer with a mortar shell. Knocked out the power on our block and a few others about 15 minutes after midnight. I was 12 and thought it was funny. I guess I never truly believed society could crumble from some 1s and 0s. However, a cowlook of guests who were my parents started wailing like Armageddon had just began. It was funny. A law firm co-worker was obsessed with it. She was a Jesus freak who was convinced it was the end of the world. Starting about 2 years before she started selling off all her shit and bought herself a corner of a property somewhere in Idaho. She bought a hand-crank clothes washer, wood stove, and had a cabin built. She bought books like When There Is No Doctor and When There Is No Dentist and other survivalist books. She also bought guns and rifles and took shooting lessons. We found out when she left an email to a friend on the common printer where she discussed having gone to the range that weekend and shooting like 3,000 rounds. Because she was a Jesus freak, she also thought Y2K was gonna be the start of Armageddon. So it was easy to imagine her standing on the porch of her shotgun shack blowing away the neighbors all the while singing Jesus Loves Me. She quit about 3 months before and moved into her cabin. Nobody ever heard from her after that. The husband of a co-worker in that same firm was also just like that except for the Jesus Christ part. He stockpiled weapons, also was a security guard who months after Y2K was nabbed by the feds for gun trafficking. But that's another story. Starting at about 8 PM on night he got on the internet to track the world ending as midnight crept across the world. And was in chat rooms with his fellow survivalists all the while. So at about 12:03 local time, his wife quietly unplugged his modem long enough for him to flip the duck out. Then quietly plugged it in. I was working as a 911 operator in Canada. Its staff and the mayor were all wringing their hands about midnight. At the stroke of midnight, numerous panicky calls about an apartment building on fire came in. I tried to dispatch that town's fire trucks and came up totally empty. It was a blank screen. So we did it the old-fashioned way and made phone calls. Turns out the glitch wasn't related to Y2K but was a human error. I worked for a software company. We had worked very hard to eliminate any Y2K glitches from our products and thought we had succeeded, but to reassure our customers, major life insurance companies were standing by, at home, to troubleshoot as midnight crept across the nation. Needless to say, it was a sober night for the team. I was beginning to be relieved both for our product and the general infrastructure when, at approximately 12:15 AM CST on the 1st of January 2000, we lost power. First thought was that it was a Y2K issue, but about 20 minutes later power came back. Just a coincidental normal power outage. I did relax enough after that to have a drink. Even though we still had MST and PST midnight to get through. My mom was pregnant with my brother at the time and really wanted to have him before Y2K just in case all electronics stopped working. So she forced him out 2 days before lol. He is technically a 90s baby by barely 2 days. Not my story. But a good friend of mine at the time had a mother who was, well, anyway. She wasn't allowed out of the house. She told me her mom made them kneel in the living room for hours to pray without ceasing. They had a stockpile of food and water. And they were able to talk her mom out of barricading all the doors and windows. But her mom made them pray until about 1245. When she didn't die. Claimed that they and their prayers had stopped Y2K. Was in 4th grade. Grew up in the country and I remember hearing all year that the power was going to go out and computers were going to go out. Me and my cousins were convinced this was gonna basically be the end of times, so our natural instinct was to dig a massive freaking hole in our back pasture because obviously houses were going to fall apart and we were gonna need a place to live. My 4 cousins and I dug for 2 weeks. Just shovels. We worked our asses off. We all tunneled our own rooms after the hole was deep enough. We built a pretty amazing cave for a bunch of 8-12-year-olds. We had a couple close calls in terms of collapses. We had to dig one of my cousins out. I didn't realize until I got older how dangerous and stupid it was. Anyways. We get done on night and head inside for supper. We didn't tell anyone where we dug the hole. We were getting ready to eat and my dad had gone to feed the livestock before supper. We started eating without him and about 2 bites into my food I hear this loud deafening yell. It was my dad yelling, "Boys, get outside now." We all froze. I knew we were in trouble. We get outside and he starts staring into us. Most of what he was yelling was inaudible. You couldn't see that back pasture from the house, so we had to walk down the road a ways until it opened up behind a thick line of trees. When we get to the clearing, all I can see is the bed of Dad's truck straight up in the air. He drove straight into the hole we had dug. Needless to say, I got my ass whooped. Grounded and banned from digging holes unless I had permission. All because I thought the world was gonna end because of Y2K. I was night shift for it. Watched the one system we deliberately hadn't patched as it was being phased out. Waited to see it crash. We knew it wasn't compliant. Nothing. Duck all. It finally failed in February. We never bothered to look at what happened, that I know of. My family and cousins took a road trip to a resort hotel to celebrate for a few days. My brother had a stomach flu on Christmas, but still brought it with him. Slowly but surely. One by one we all got it. My cousin, mom, aunt, myself, and my dad. We only had 2 small condos between all of us. And we all started to smell like vomit. We all caught the Y2K bug. The cherry on top happened when we drove back home. We were caught in a snowstorm bad enough that we pulled into a hotel off the highway and stayed for several hours to wait out the storm. Got paid extra to shut down the factory and prepare for imminent disaster. Had a great laugh when overall nothing happened. At my multinational we spent £70 million on Y2K testing and upgrading kit. There was actually only one system that would have failed, but it was a chance to consolidate our IT and have it ready for rolling out Windows XP. We took it as an opportunity to rationalize and professionalize our IT infrastructure. All those little homebrew networks and software systems finally bit the dust. There were big bonuses for the people that volunteered to be on shift that night. Just in case. Lots of food and alcohol when the last country had gone past midnight. I went to a street party with my then boyfriend. He wandered off and I ended up trapped in a conversation with an elderly man who asked me if I'd ever let a dog lick my labia. He gave me a few reasons why I should try it and I had no idea how to get away or say no in another way without being violent. That's most of what I remember from Y2K. So thank you, old man.